The old, which is the Kenya-Uganda Railway, was more of an extractive railway. The SGR, that is a partnership between China and Kenya, it is development-oriented.
In the National Museum of Kenya, a sign reads, "It is not uncommon for a country to create a railway, but it is uncommon for a railway to create a country." The quote here does not refer to Kenya, but the British East Africa Protectorate, which is the predecessor of Kenya. The man who uttered these words was Charles Elliot, the British Commissioner for the East Africa Protectorate. Why did the British build a railway line in its East Africa Protectorate? It starts with a conference of Western powers. On November 15, 1884, leaders of European powers, among them Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, and the United States, came together in Berlin to discuss control of Africa's resources. The Berlin Conference, which lasted more than 100 days, marked the climax of the colonial partitioning of Africa. In 1885, the Western powers occupied about 20% of Africa. 15 years later, in 1900, their occupation had risen to 90.4%. Look at a world map and you will find the borders of many African countries are straight lines. That was how European powers drew up boundaries to demarcate the conquered territories on the continent. For example, the boundary between the then British East Africa and German East Africa was basically a straight line. As you can see on this map, British East Africa includes the modern-day Uganda and Kenya. Initially, the British controlled the coastal areas of East Africa. To enter and occupy the hinterland of East Africa, the British began to build an east-west railway line connecting the coast with Lake Victoria, Africa's largest freshwater body.
Those who will praise it as a key component in Kenya's birth, or what you call the birth of a nation, and there are those who are more of saying that it played a role in colonizing Kenya.
An ancient East African tribal prophecy says an iron snake would someday cross their land, and the arrival of the white tribe along with it would bring disaster for the natives. In 1896, the year after Britain proclaimed the East Africa Protectorate, the British began building a railway line from the port city of Mombasa, northwestward to the hinterland, with the aim of connecting it with Uganda, another land coveted by Britain. The British named it the Uganda Railway after its ultimate destination.
The construction of Kenya Railways, actually, it was not Kenya Railways. You see, the people who are engaged in the construction of the line were not the locals, actually. The real builders were the Indian coolies.
The British brought over 30,000 coolies from British India to construct the railway line. Due to the harsh working conditions, 4 workers died each mile. In total, 2,493 contract workers died in the process. On average, 38 workers died per month. Another 6,500 Indian workers were wounded or crippled. In 1901, the railway line was completed, reaching the eastern shore of Lake Victoria, and the British entered and occupied the hinterland of East Africa along the rail.
It was more of a colonial policy that was more of extractive than implementing development. The railway was basically to be able to transport goods from the hinterland, and especially the raw materials and minerals.
It also met a lot of challenges from the locals. Locals with their tribal chiefs formed the resistance for the white people when they came to occupy.
Among them, the Nandi tribe in the Western Highlands formed the longest and most tenacious resistance. In 1905, British Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen, an intelligent officer, arranged a meeting with the chief of the Nandi people. The despicable British man shot dead the tribal chief while shaking his hand, and his men killed the tribal chief's entourage, ending the decade-long resistance. Entering the hinterland, Europeans began to move in on a large scale, taking it as their own land. In 1899, when the railway line reached Nairobi, today's capital of Kenya, the colonists found this central area an ideal resting place due to its high elevation and temperate climate, and they gradually developed it into a town. Commissioner Charles Elliot initiated the policy of white supremacy in the East Africa Protectorate, which allocated large areas of land to white settlers. This 1912 poster reads, Uganda Railway, the gateway to British East Africa. Another poster says, the highlands of British East Africa as a winter home for aristocrats has become a fashion. The railway line, a train and a station with the British flag can be seen on the poster. Next to the rail are various kinds of wild animals. In 1920, the East Africa Protectorate was transformed into the British colony of Kenya. Large swaths of agricultural land was grabbed by white settlers to grow coffee, tea and other crops cherished by Europeans, which were transported by rail to Indian Ocean ports and then to Europe. The white settlers lived a life of luxury. The natives lost their land and were forced by the policies of the colonial authorities to provide cheap labor on white settlers' farms. As more Europeans came to settle in the Kenya colony, the land for natives shrank rapidly. The natives' sense of resistance began to awaken. A number of organizations for land rights were quietly established. A young activist, Jomo Kenyatta, later became Kenya's first president. A storm of resistance was brewing among those who were deprived of their land.
What was the issue of conflict, which now led to the uprising of the Mau Mau, or what we call the Mau Mau Rebellion. Kenyans whose land were taken away formed groups and began now to fight.
In 1952, the long-simmering anger boiled over. A secret organization called Mau Mau waged a massive armed struggle against colonial rule, with slogans of reclaiming land, abolishing racial discrimination, and fighting for survival and independence. The Mau Mau movement grew rapidly. It is said hundreds of thousands of Kenyans joined the uprising, and the Mau Mau fighters once numbered around 15,000. The vast resistance movement was brutally suppressed by the colonial authorities. About 150,000 Kenyans were put into detention camps and suffered torture and forced labor. The uprising lasted until 1956, and at its peak, tens of thousands of Kenyans were killed in a brutal manner. Despite its eventual halt, the uprising pushed Kenya towards independence and even inspired anti-colonial movements in other African countries. In the 1950s and 1960s, the liberation movements of the Asian and African nations surged. More than 30 African countries got rid of colonial rule. On December 12, 1963, Kenya gained independence from Britain. Today, in downtown Nairobi stands a statue of Dedan Kimathi, the iconic leader of the Mau Mau uprising, who was captured and executed by the colonial authorities in 1956. A sign beneath his statue reads his words, "It is better to die on our feet than live on our knees for fear of colonial rule." In 1977, the Kenya Railways Corporation was established to operate the railway left by the colonists. Seveli Mwalemi joined the Kenya Railways in his 20s and worked as a locomotive driver on the rail for more than 30 years. Today, the old meter gauge railway is still running, but had long been unable to meet the growing demand of Kenya's freight and passenger transportation. And in some parts of central Kenya and Rift Valley highlands, many tea farms are still owned by Western companies. More than 60 years ago, Kenya got rid of the colonial rule, but the colonial economic model is still inhibiting the development of Kenya. Economists believe that Kenya's economic structure still has the attributes of catering to Western countries. Its tourism industry still mainly serves Western visitors. The economy relies on exports of coffee beans and tea, while most of them still go to Western companies for processing and sale. Manufactured goods are mainly imported, and industrialization still has a long way to go. These are issues that are troubling many former colonies in Africa. To push for social economic development, Kenya has built a new railway with China's help. It connects Mombasa, East Africa's largest seaport, with the capital, Nairobi, known as the Nairobi-Mombasa Standard Gauge Railway, or SGR. The new railway, built by a Chinese enterprise with Chinese standards, was put into use in mid-2017. It is Kenya's first railway and its largest infrastructure project since the country gained independence. The SGR has cut land journeys between Mombasa and Nairobi from about 10 hours to around 5 hours and has created tens of thousands of jobs for locals. Mwalemi has also turned a new page in his life due to the modern railway.
I joined Afristar, the SGR operator, on January 9, 2021. I currently hold the position of Assistant Manager at SGR in the Locomotive and Rolling Stock Department. My daily responsibilities and tasks entail overseeing the smooth running of daily programs by the operations workshop team.
The SGR has upgraded regional freight and passenger transport and has facilitated import and export of goods and services.
What Kenya and maybe the larger African continent should do is develop own capacity. The SGR handles most of the imports and exports into and from Kenya and her neighbors. It's one of the largest contributors for the country.
The old, this is the Kenya-Uganda Railway, was more of an extractive railway. The SGR, that is a partnership between China and Kenya, it is development-oriented. It helps Kenya to integrate with the other East African countries. It's creating fast and efficient mode of transport for goods and passengers. It's helping Kenya to grow. We have to industrialize. We have to push for more infrastructure development. That needs to be our key agenda.